Your name isn't on the guest list, sir. Those 7 words hit harder than I expected. The young woman at the stadium entrance looked genuinely uncomfortable as she glanced from her clipboard back to me. Are you sure? I asked with a small smile. My grandson is graduating today. She checked again, running her finger carefully down the page. Then she shook her head. I'm sorry. I don't see your name anywhere. I thanked her anyway. It wasn't her fault. She was just doing her job. I stepped aside and stood near a concrete pillar overlooking the crowd streaming toward the football stadium. Families carried flowers, balloons, and cameras. Proud parents walked arm in arm. Grandparents wore their Sunday best. Everywhere I looked, people were gathering to celebrate one of life's important milestones. And there I was, 72 years old, wearing the navy blazer my late wife always loved, standing alone outside a graduation ceremony for my own grandson. My name is Harold Whitmore. I spent 43 years as a civil engineer in Ohio. I built bridges, highways, and municipal buildings across 3 states. I worked long hours. I missed vacations. I sacrificed weekends. Not because I loved working, but because I loved my family. Every overtime shift, every consulting project, every extra contract had one purpose. I wanted future generations of my family to have opportunities one never had growing up. That morning, I had polished my shoes before sunrise. I ironed my shirt twice. I even dug out the old silver watch my wife gave me on our 25th wedding anniversary. Ethan was graduating from high school. My grandson, the first grandchild in our family. I had imagined this day for years. Yet somehow, I was standing outside the gates while strangers walked in. I told myself there had to be a misunderstanding. Maybe the school had made a mistake. Maybe a ticket had gotten lost. Maybe Ethan had forgotten to mention something. There had to be a reasonable explanation. At least that was what I kept telling myself. Then I saw them. My son Daniel emerged from the parking lot carrying a camera bag. Beside him walked his wife, Vanessa. She wore a bright summer dress and oversized sunglasses. Ethan walked between them in his graduation gown, laughing about something on his phone. They looked happy, relaxed, excited. For a brief second, I expected Daniel to spot me. I imagined him waving me over. I imagined Vanessa looking surprised and apologizing for the confusion. Instead, they walked straight toward the entrance. Nobody looked in my direction. Nobody searched the crowd for me. Nobody seemed to notice I wasn't there. I watched as the usher scanned their tickets. Seconds later, they disappeared through the gate. The entire exchange lasted less than a minute. Somehow it felt much longer. I stood there staring at the entrance long after they had vanished from sight. A warm June breeze moved across the parking lot. Somewhere nearby, a marching band began playing. Parents hurried past carrying bouquets wrapped in plastic. I suddenly felt very old. Not weak. Not fragile. Just old. Like someone who belonged to a different chapter of the story. I sat on a bench near the stadium and pulled out my phone. There were no missed calls. No text messages. No explanation. Nothing. I scrolled through old photos instead. Ethan at age 6 holding the fishing rod I bought him. Ethan at 10 showing me his science fair ribbon. Ethan at 14 sitting beside me during a baseball game. Looking at those pictures, it became difficult to reconcile the smiling boy I remembered with the young man graduating a few hundred feet away without me. The ceremony lasted nearly 2 hours. I never left. I sat there listening to muffled announcements through the stadium speakers. Occasionally, cheers erupted from inside. Every burst of applause reminded me of what I was missing. Eventually, the ceremony ended. Families flooded back outside. Laughter echoed across the parking lot. Graduates posed for pictures. Parents wiped tears from their eyes. Grandparents hugged grandchildren. I remained on the bench, hidden among strangers. Daniel and Vanessa eventually emerged with Ethan. They were carrying flowers and taking photos. Ethan looked proud. He deserved to feel proud. He had worked hard. For a moment, I considered walking over. Maybe I could congratulate him. Maybe. We could take one picture together. Then Vanessa placed an arm around Ethan and turned him toward another camera. The family formed a perfect semicircle. Smiling, laughing, celebrating. There was no place for me in that photograph. I understood that now. Quietly, I stood and returned to my truck. The drive home took 37 minutes. I remember because I looked at the dashboard clock several times. The house felt unusually silent when I walked inside. I loosened my tie, set my keys on the kitchen counter, and poured myself a glass of iced tea. Then I sat alone at the dining room table. The same table where I had spent years planning birthday parties, holiday dinners, and family gatherings. Around sunset, my phone buzzed. I glanced down. Vanessa had posted a new photo online. Perfect family day, the caption read. Beneath it were 6 photographs from the graduation. Daniel smiling. Ethan holding his diploma. Vanessa hugging her son. Relatives and friends gathered together. Every important person seemed to be there. Everyone except me. I studied those images for a long time. Not because I was angry. Not because I was jealous. I was trying to understand something. Trying to figure out when I had stopped being part of the family and become someone they simply tolerated. Then my eyes settled on one particular picture. Ethan stood in the center holding his diploma. Behind him stood Daniel and Vanessa, both smiling proudly. Looking at that photograph, a realization finally settled over me. This had not been an accident. This had not been a misunderstanding. Someone had made a decision. Someone had decided I didn't belong there. And for the first time all day, I stopped asking why. Instead, I found myself asking a very different question. What happens when people decide to treat you like a stranger after you've spent years investing in their future? That question stayed with me long after the sun disappeared and the house settled into its familiar evening silence. I sat at the dining room table until the ice in my glass had completely melted. The photographs on my phone remained open. Every time I looked away, I found myself looking back again. It was not because I wanted to punish myself. It was because I was searching for something I could not quite name. Some sign that I had misunderstood the situation. Some clue that would make everything feel less deliberate. But the more I studied those smiling faces, the harder it became to believe any of it was accidental. Around 9 o'clock, I finally stood up and walked to my study. The room had always been my favorite place in the house. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined the walls. Old engineering awards sat quietly in glass cabinets. Framed family photographs occupied nearly every available surface. My eyes settled on one picture in particular. Ethan was 7 years old. He was standing beside a small bicycle, grinning from ear to ear. I remembered that day perfectly. Daniel and Vanessa had been struggling financially at the time. Daniel had recently changed jobs, and money was tight. Ethan wanted a bicycle like the other kids in the neighborhood. Nothing fancy, just a simple blue bike with training wheels. I had bought it for him without hesitation. The smile on his face had made every dollar worthwhile. Looking back now, that bicycle was only the beginning. Over the years there had been baseball equipment, summer camps, science kits, school trips, tutoring programs, laptops, and countless birthday gifts. I never kept score. Families are not supposed to keep score. When you love someone, you help when you can. That was how I had always viewed it. Yet as I stood in that study surrounded by memories, a troubling pattern began to emerge. Many of the moments I treasured most had occurred years ago. Recently, things had been different. So gradual that I barely noticed at first. Small changes, tiny exclusions, invitations that stopped arriving, events I learned about afterward instead of beforehand, phone calls that grew shorter, visits that became less frequent, excuses that sounded reasonable when considered individually but suspicious when viewed together. I sat behind my desk and opened an old photo album. The pages told a story I had not wanted to see. Ethan's Little League Championship. I had not attended because Vanessa claimed the game schedule had changed at the last minute. Ethan's middle school awards ceremony. I found out about it from a social media post 2 days later. A family vacation to Florida. Daniel told me they had decided to keep it small. A month afterward, I discovered half a dozen relatives had joined them. At the time, I accepted every explanation. I trusted my family. Perhaps too much. Around 10:30, my phone buzzed. For a brief moment, I thought it might be Ethan. Perhaps he had realized I was missing. Perhaps he wanted to know where I had been. Instead, it was a message from an old friend named Walter. Congratulations on Ethan's graduation, he wrote. You must be one proud grandfather tonight. I stared at the message for several seconds. Then I typed back a short response. Yes, very proud. That was all. I could not bring myself to explain the rest. The following morning, I woke earlier than usual. Years of engineering work had trained my body to rise before sunrise. I brewed coffee, carried the mug onto the back porch, and watched the neighborhood slowly come alive. Sprinklers clicked across freshly cut lawns. Birds gathered near the maple tree at the edge of my property. Everything looked normal, yet something inside me felt different. Not angry, not bitter, clearer, like a fog that had lingered for years was finally beginning to lift. Around 8 o'clock, I opened my email and started sorting through old financial records. I had no specific goal in mind, at least not initially. I simply wanted to review some documents. One folder led to another, then another. Eventually, I found the file I was looking for. The Educational Trust Fund. I stared at the number on the screen. $100,000. It had taken years to build. Small contributions at first, then larger deposits after consulting contracts and investment gains. Every decision had been made with Ethan's future in mind. College tuition, housing expenses, books, opportunities, a better start in life. I remembered the day I established the account. Ethan was only 5 years old. My wife Margaret had still been alive then. We sat together at the kitchen table, discussing what we could leave behind for future generations. Margaret believed education changed lives. She often said that opportunities were the greatest inheritance a person could receive. I smiled sadly at the memory. She would have adored seeing Ethan graduate. She would have been heartbroken by everything else. My attention returned to the account statements. For years, I had viewed that fund as a certainty, a promise, something inevitable. But for the first time, I found myself considering a question I had never asked before. What obligation does a person have to continue investing in relationships that exist only on paper? I closed the file and leaned back in my chair. Outside the study window, sunlight spilled across the backyard. Somewhere in the distance, a lawn mower hummed steadily. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary morning. Yet beneath that calm surface, something important had shifted. I no longer felt confused about what had happened at the graduation. The confusion was gone. In its place was understanding. And understanding can be far more powerful than anger. The next few days passed quietly. On the surface, nothing seemed different. The world continued moving forward exactly as it always had. Neighbors mowed their lawns. Delivery trucks rolled through the neighborhood. The grocery store remained crowded every afternoon. Yet inside my mind, old memories kept resurfacing, each one bringing a little more clarity. It was remarkable how many things I had overlooked simply because I wanted to believe the best about the people I loved. Once I started paying attention, the pattern became impossible to ignore. 3 years earlier, Ethan had joined the high school baseball team. I remembered asking Daniel for the schedule so I could attend a few games. He told me they would send it later. The schedule never arrived. Months afterward, I discovered Ethan had played nearly an entire season. Vanessa had posted photographs from several games online. In every picture, family members filled the bleachers. I was nowhere to be seen because I had never been told when the games were taking place. At the time, I convinced myself it was an innocent oversight. Then there was Ethan's 16th birthday. I spent weeks looking for the perfect gift. He had recently become interested in photography, so I purchased a quality camera. Not the most expensive model, but one that would allow him to learn and grow. The birthday party was held on a Saturday afternoon. Daniel called me that morning and explained that Ethan had come down with a stomach bug and the celebration had been postponed. 2 days later, photographs appeared online showing a backyard party filled with relatives and friends. Everyone had attended. Everyone except me. I remembered staring at those pictures with mild confusion before eventually letting the matter go. Looking back, I should have paid closer attention. The exclusions had not started with graduation. Graduation had simply been the first time they could no longer be explained away. One afternoon, while sorting through old paperwork in my study, I came across a folder labeled Family Trust Documents. Inside were records stretching back more than a decade. Contribution statements, tax documents, meeting notes, letters from financial advisors. I spent hours reviewing everything. The account had grown steadily over the years. Every deposit represented a choice. Sometimes I skipped vacations. Sometimes I delayed home renovations. Sometimes I turned down personal purchases because I wanted that fund to continue growing. I never regretted those sacrifices. At least not then. Around 4 o'clock, the phone rang. The caller identification displayed Daniel's name. For a moment, I simply stared at the screen. It had been 5 days since graduation. 5 days without a call. 5 days without a text message. 5 days without anyone asking where I had been. Eventually, I answered. "Hello, Dad," Daniel said. His voice sounded cheerful, casual, as though nothing unusual had happened. "How are you doing?" I leaned back in my chair. "I am doing fine." A brief silence followed. I waited. Surely he would mention the ceremony. Surely he would ask why I had not attended. Instead, he began talking about work. A new client. A busy schedule. Traffic near his office. Ordinary conversation. After several minutes, I realized something unsettling. Daniel was not avoiding the topic. He genuinely did not seem to think there was anything to discuss. The graduation had happened. Life had moved on. As far as he was concerned, the matter was closed. "How is Ethan?" I finally asked. "He is great," Daniel replied. "Really excited about college." Another silence settled between us. Then Daniel laughed softly. "Time flies, does it not?" I looked at the family photographs lining my bookshelf. "Yes," I said quietly. "It certainly does." The call ended a few minutes later. Not once did he ask whether I had attended. Not once did he wonder where I had been sitting. Not once did he acknowledge my absence. Afterward, I remained at my desk for a long time. I was not angry. The anger had already faded. What remained was disappointment, deep and undeniable. A few evenings later, I attended a monthly dinner hosted by several retired colleagues. We met at the same family-owned restaurant every month. Most of us were in our 70s now. The conversations usually revolved around grandchildren, hobbies, and health concerns. During dessert, my friend Walter pulled out his phone. "Look at this," he said proudly. It was a photograph from his granddaughter's graduation. She stood between Walter and his wife, all three smiling broadly. Another man at the table shared pictures from his grandson's ceremony. Then another. One by one, they passed around photographs filled with family pride and celebration. I smiled and congratulated each of them. Nobody noticed that I shared no pictures of my own. Driving home that night, I realized something important. Being excluded from a single event was painful. But the deeper wound came from understanding what that exclusion represented. It was not about a seat in a stadium. It was not about a photograph. It was not even about one graduation ceremony. It was about years of being quietly pushed farther and farther toward the edge of my own family, until one day there was no place left for me at all. When I arrived home, I walked directly into my study and opened the trust fund documents again. This time, I was not reviewing history. This time, I was looking toward the future. And for the first time since establishing the account, I began wondering whether the purpose of that money still existed. The following Tuesday, I scheduled an appointment with the financial advisory firm that had managed the educational trust for years. The office sat on the third floor of a brick building downtown, overlooking the river. I had walked through those same glass doors many times before. Usually, I arrived feeling optimistic. Proud, even. Each annual review represented another step toward securing opportunities for my grandson. This visit felt different. When I entered the conference room, my advisor, Michael Jensen, greeted me warmly. We had worked together for nearly 12 years. He knew the account almost as well as I did. After a few minutes of small talk, he opened a folder and reviewed the latest statements. The numbers were strong. Investments had performed well. The fund remained healthy and fully under my control. Michael smiled. "You should feel good about what you have built, Harold. Not many grandparents commit to something like this for so long." I nodded but said nothing. My eyes remained on the paperwork spread across the polished conference table. Eventually, Michael noticed my unusual silence. "Is something bothering you?" he asked carefully. I considered brushing the question aside. For most of my life, I had handled personal disappointments privately, but something about the past few weeks had changed that instinct. "Have you ever invested in something for years?" I asked quietly, only to realize the people receiving it no longer value your presence? Michael leaned back slightly. He did not answer immediately. "That sounds less like a financial question and more like a family question." I smiled faintly. "Perhaps it is." For the next 20 minutes, we discussed technical details of the account, beneficiaries, distribution schedules, educational restrictions, tax considerations, facts, numbers, legal language. Yet underneath every discussion sat a much larger issue that neither of us needed to state directly. By the end of the meeting, one fact stood above all others. The trust fund still belonged to me. Every dollar, every decision, every future distribution required my authorization. I left the office carrying a thin folder and a much heavier understanding of my situation. Outside, the summer sun reflected off parked cars and office windows. People hurried along the sidewalks carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Life continued normally for everyone else. Meanwhile, I found myself thinking about Margaret again. My wife had possessed a remarkable ability to recognize uncomfortable truths long before I could. She understood people in ways I never quite managed. That evening, I opened a wooden box stored in my bedroom closet. Inside were letters, photographs, and keepsakes from our marriage. Near the bottom sat a folded note written in Margaret's familiar handwriting. I had read it many times over the years. Yet that night, the words felt especially relevant. One sentence stood out more than the others. Love should never be confused with obligation. I sat quietly holding that note for a long time. Somewhere over the years, I had begun treating the trust fund as an obligation. Not a gift freely given, but a responsibility I was required to fulfill regardless of circumstances. Margaret would have challenged that thinking immediately. She believed generosity mattered, but she also believed respect mattered. The next morning, I received another unexpected reminder of the contrast between those values. While checking my mailbox, I found a handwritten envelope from a local scholarship foundation. Several months earlier, I had made a modest donation supporting students from low-income families. The letter contained photographs and thank you notes from scholarship recipients. One young woman wrote about becoming the first person in her family to attend college. Another student described working 2 part-time jobs while maintaining excellent grades. Their words were simple and sincere. Gratitude filled every sentence. I read those letters twice. Then I placed them carefully on the kitchen table beside the trust fund documents. The comparison lingered in my mind throughout the day. Gratitude, respect, presence, family, responsibility. The concepts seemed increasingly connected. Later that week, I attended Ethan's graduation party. Or rather, I learned there had been one. A neighbor mentioned seeing photographs online. Apparently dozens of guests had attended. Friends, relatives, co-workers, and classmates. Once again, I had not been invited. This time, however, the news affected me differently. A month earlier, I might have spent days searching for explanations. I might have convinced myself there had been another misunderstanding. Instead, I simply accepted the information for what it was. Another decision, another choice, another clear message about where I stood within the family hierarchy Vanessa had gradually constructed over the years. That realization hurt, but it also brought clarity. Clarity can be painful, yet it has a way of freeing a person from illusions. By Friday afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in my study once more. The trust documents rested on the desk beside Margaret's handwritten note and the scholarship letters from local students. 3 separate reminders. 3 different perspectives on the same question. I looked around the room at decades of memories. Family photographs, engineering awards, vacation souvenirs, a lifetime condensed into shelves and frames. Then my eyes settled on the trust fund folder. For years, I had viewed that account as a bridge connecting generations. Now I wondered whether the bridge still existed at all. Because a bridge requires people willing to meet in the middle. And lately, I seemed to be the only one still standing on it. The answer arrived from a place I never expected. It was a Thursday afternoon when my phone rang. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number from a neighboring town. Normally, I ignored calls from unknown numbers, but something prompted me to answer. Mr. Whitmore, a woman's voice asked. Yes. My name is Karen Brooks. I work at the high school counseling office. For a moment, I felt a slight knot form in my stomach. Is everything all right? I asked. Oh yes, she replied quickly. Nothing is wrong. I hope I am not bothering you. I actually called because I wanted to thank you. I frowned slightly. Thank me. Several years ago, you donated equipment to our engineering club. The students still use it today. We were reviewing donor records. And your name came up. One of our counselors mentioned that your grandson recently graduated. I smiled faintly. Yes, he did. There was a brief pause. Then Karen said something that caught my attention. I remember seeing your grandson's family several times this year. They attended nearly every school function. I remained silent. Your grandson often spoke about family support, she continued. That is why I was surprised I never met you. Most grandparents who are involved at the level you have been tend to attend at least one event. My grip tightened slightly around the phone. I suppose things do not always work out that way. Another pause followed. Then her voice softened. Forgive me if I am overstepping, Mr. Whitmore, but there was something I always found unusual. I did not respond immediately. What do you mean? Karen hesitated. There were several occasions when staff members asked whether invitations should be mailed to grandparents listed in student records. Your name came up more than once. My heart beat a little faster. And each time, we were told not to send anything directly. The room suddenly felt very still. Who told you that? I asked carefully. I cannot speak for every situation, Karen said. But I personally heard one request from a parent during a planning meeting. She paused again. It was your grandson's mother. I stared through the study window at the backyard. The maple tree swayed gently in the summer breeze. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. Everything looked perfectly ordinary. Yet those few words changed something inside me. Not because they shocked me. By then, I already suspected the truth. What mattered was confirmation. For years I had questioned my own judgment. I had wondered whether I was being too sensitive, too suspicious, too emotional. Now someone completely outside the family had unknowingly confirmed what I had spent years trying not to believe. After we ended the call, I remained seated for a long time. I did not feel angry. I did not feel triumphant. Mostly, I felt tired. Tired of making excuses for people who never extended the same courtesy to me. Tired of pretending that every exclusion had been accidental. Tired of carrying a relationship entirely on my own shoulders. That evening, I opened a photo album and slowly turned the pages. There was Ethan at age 8 holding a fish nearly half his size. There he was at 12 standing beside the model bridge we built together in my garage. Another photograph showed us at a county fair eating oversized corn dogs and laughing about something I could no longer remember. The memories were real. The love was real. That was what made everything so difficult. If there had never been affection, the decision ahead would have been easy. But relationships are rarely that simple. I loved my grandson. I still did. Nothing could erase the years we shared. Yet love and access were no longer connected. Love remained. Access had been removed. Respect had disappeared somewhere along the way as well. Near sunset, I carried a chair onto the back porch and watched the sky change colors. Margaret used to love evenings like that. She often said difficult decisions become clearer when you stop arguing with reality. At the time, I never fully understood what she meant. Sitting there alone, I finally did. Reality was not cruel. Reality was simply honest. The people I had spent years supporting had shown me exactly where I stood in their lives. Not once, not twice, repeatedly, consistently, deliberately. The graduation had merely exposed what had already existed beneath the surface. When darkness settled over the neighborhood, I returned to my study. The trust fund documents remained exactly where I had left them. I sat down, opened the folder, and reviewed every page one more time. Then I picked up the phone and scheduled a second appointment with Michael Jensen. This time, I knew precisely what questions I intended to ask. Michael greeted me with a more serious expression during our second meeting. He had probably sensed from my phone call that this appointment would be different from previous reviews. After we exchanged a few pleasantries, he closed the conference room door and took a seat across from me. The trust fund documents were already waiting on the table. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he folded his hands together and looked directly at me. "You sound like a man who has made a decision," he said. I glanced toward the large window overlooking downtown traffic. "I think I have." Michael nodded slowly. "Then tell me what you were thinking." I took a deep breath. Surprisingly, the words came easily. I explained everything. The missing invitations, the graduation, the years of exclusions, the phone call from the school counselor, the realization that the distance had not happened by accident. Michael listened carefully without interrupting. When I finished, he remained silent for a moment. "That is a painful situation, Harold." I offered a faint smile. It was painful when I still believed it might change. Now it is simply clear. He looked down at the documents. "And the fund." I rested my hand on the folder. "I created this because I believed I was helping build a future relationship as much as a financial future. Somewhere along the way, only one side of that arrangement remained." Michael leaned back in his chair. "You understand the consequences if you choose to redirect these assets." "I do. There is no legal obligation requiring you to continue the current plan." "I understand that too." Another silence settled over the room. Then he asked the question I had been expecting. "Are you acting out of anger?" The answer came immediately. "No." He studied my face for several seconds. Then he nodded. "I believe you." That simple statement mattered more than he probably realized. For weeks, I had examined my motives repeatedly. Anger burns hot. What I felt now was different. Quieter. More deliberate. Like finally accepting a truth that had been standing in front of me for years. Michael opened a new folder. Inside were several alternative options for charitable giving, scholarship programs, and community foundations. We reviewed them one by one. Educational scholarships, technical training grants, programs supporting first-generation college students, local youth organizations. The more we discussed these possibilities, the more certain I became. Every page contained stories of young people working hard for opportunities they might never otherwise receive. Students balancing school and part-time jobs. Teenagers overcoming difficult circumstances. Young adults striving toward goals with determination and gratitude. I found myself thinking about the letters I had received earlier that week. Their words had been sincere, humble, appreciative. Eventually, one scholarship foundation caught my attention. It served students from rural communities across the state. Many pursued engineering, mathematics, and technical careers, fields I had spent my life working in. Michael noticed my interest immediately. "This program has an excellent reputation," he said. "Several recipients have gone on to successful careers." I read through the information carefully. Then I smiled for the first time that afternoon. "Margaret would have liked this one." Michael nodded. "Then perhaps that tells you something." The meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. By the end, the framework of a new plan had taken shape. Nothing was finalized that day, but the direction was clear. When I left the building, I felt unexpectedly calm. Not triumphant, not vindictive, simply calm. For the first time in months, I sensed that I was moving toward something instead of merely reacting to disappointment. Over the following week, paperwork began moving through the appropriate channels. Meetings were scheduled, documents were reviewed, signatures were prepared. The process required patience and attention to detail, both qualities that engineering had taught me decades earlier. During that same week, my family remained completely silent. No calls from Vanessa, no messages from Ethan, no invitations, no questions. It was remarkable, really. An entire month had nearly passed since graduation, yet nobody seemed concerned about my absence. One evening, while watering flowers in the backyard, I noticed a neighbor waving from across the street. Mrs. Henderson had lived nearby for years. She approached carrying a small basket of tomatoes from her garden. We chatted for a few minutes about the weather and neighborhood news. Then she mentioned her granddaughter's upcoming college orientation. Her eyes lit up as she described helping prepare for the transition. Before leaving, she smiled warmly and said, "Family keeps us busy, does it not?" I smiled back. "Sometimes it does." After she walked away, I stood quietly beside the garden hose for several moments. Family. The word felt different now. Smaller in some ways, larger in others. I had spent years defining family exclusively through blood and obligation. Perhaps that definition had always been incomplete. Perhaps family also included respect, reciprocity, and genuine presence. The following Friday morning, Michael called. "Everything is ready," he said. I thanked him and hung up. Then I sat alone in my kitchen with a cup of coffee growing cold beside me. The documents would be signed that afternoon. A decision more than a decade in the making would finally become official. I expected to feel nervous. Instead, I felt surprisingly peaceful. The uncertainty was gone. The excuses were gone. The confusion was gone. All that remained was a simple understanding. Generosity is a gift. Respect is not optional. And sometimes the hardest lesson a person learns is that continuing to give does not always make a relationship stronger. Sometimes it merely teaches other people that your presence can be taken for granted. Friday afternoon arrived with clear skies and warm temperatures. The kind of summer day that usually encouraged people to leave work early and spend time outdoors. I drove downtown with the windows partially open, listening to the familiar hum of traffic and the occasional sound of birds overhead. Nothing about the day felt dramatic. That seemed fitting. The most important decisions in my life had rarely arrived with fanfare. They happened quietly, one thoughtful step at a time. When I entered Michael's office, the conference room was already prepared. Several folders rested neatly on the table. A representative from the Scholarship Foundation had joined us as well. Her name was Rebecca Collins. She appeared to be in her early 50s and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who genuinely believed in her work. After introductions, she explained how the scholarship program operated. Students submitted essays, academic records, and letters of recommendation. Selection. Committees reviewed every application carefully. Funding often made the difference between attending college and postponing those dreams indefinitely. As she spoke, I found myself thinking about the young people whose letters I had read. Students willing to work hard for opportunities. Students who valued every chance they received. Rebecca slid several documents across the table. "We are honored that you are considering this partnership," she said sincerely. "Your contribution would impact many lives for years to come." I looked down at the paperwork. Years ago, I created the educational fund because I wanted to help shape someone's future. That goal had not changed. Only the path had changed. Michael reviewed the final details one last time. Then he handed me a pen. For a brief moment, the room became completely silent. I thought about Margaret. I thought about Ethan as a little boy. I thought about every baseball game, science project, fishing trip, and birthday celebration. I thought about the stadium entrance and the young employee politely informing me that my name was not on the list. Most of all, I thought about the difference between giving from love and giving from obligation. Then I signed. One signature, then another. A few more pages followed. The entire process took less than 15 minutes. Years of planning concluded in the time it takes most people to finish a cup of coffee. When it was over, Rebecca extended her hand. "Thank you, Mr. Whitmore. You have no idea how many students this will help." I smiled and shook her hand. "I hope they make good use of it." "I am confident they will." Walking back to my truck, I expected to feel sadness. Instead, I felt lighter. Not because money had changed hands. Money had never been the true issue. What changed was the weight I had been carrying. For years, I had continued giving while receiving increasingly clear messages that my presence was unnecessary. That burden was finally gone. The following week passed quietly. I spent time gardening, reading, and meeting friends for lunch. Life settled into a comfortable rhythm. One afternoon, I received a letter from the Scholarship Foundation confirming the completed transfer. Included was a brochure featuring students who had benefited from similar programs. I sat at the kitchen table, studying their photographs. Some planned careers in medicine. Others hoped to become engineers, teachers, or small business owners. Their futures remained unwritten. Possibility filled every page. I placed the brochure beside Margaret's old note and smiled. For the first time in a long while, the future felt constructive rather than painful. Nearly 3 weeks passed before the first sign appeared that anything had changed. It happened on a Monday evening. I was watching a baseball game when my phone buzzed. A text message from Daniel appeared on the screen. The message itself was surprisingly ordinary. "Dad, give me a call when you get a chance." No explanation. No details. Just a request. I set the phone aside and continued watching the game. A second message arrived 20 minutes later. Then another the following morning. By Wednesday, Daniel had called twice. Vanessa had called once as well. The sudden increase in communication stood in sharp contrast to the silence that had defined the previous several months. Something had happened. I suspected I knew exactly what it was. Still, I did not rush to return the calls. Not out of spite. I simply wanted time to think. For years, every conversation had occurred according to their schedule, their convenience, their priorities. There was no emergency requiring immediate action. Thursday afternoon, I drove to a local diner and ordered lunch. While waiting for my meal, I glanced at my phone again. Another missed call from Daniel. Another voicemail. Another text asking me to call as soon as possible. Around me, life continued normally. Waitresses carried trays. Customers chatted over sandwiches and coffee. A family celebrated a birthday in the corner booth. Ordinary moments. Yet beneath that ordinary afternoon, I could feel the first ripples of a storm finally reaching shore. Somewhere, conversations were taking place. Questions were being asked. Assumptions were being challenged. And for the first time in many years, I was not the last person to learn what was happening. I finally returned Daniel's call on Friday morning. The phone rang only once before he answered. "Dad," he said immediately, relief flooding his voice. "Thank goodness. We have been trying to reach you." I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee beside me. I noticed. A brief silence followed. Then Daniel cleared his throat. "There seems to be some confusion regarding Ethan's college fund." The wording caught my attention. Not concern. Not gratitude. Not even curiosity. Confusion. What kind of confusion? I asked calmly. Another pause. "The financial office says the account is no longer available." I looked out the window toward the backyard. The morning sun illuminated the garden Margaret had loved so much. "That is correct," I replied. The silence that followed lasted several seconds longer this time. "Dad," Daniel finally said, "there has to be some mistake." "There is no mistake." His breathing changed slightly. I could almost picture him sitting at his kitchen counter, trying to process what he was hearing. But that money was for Ethan. It was intended for Ethan. Another long pause. Then a new voice entered the conversation. Vanessa. I had not even realized she was listening nearby. Harold, what exactly happened? She asked. Her tone remained controlled, but I could hear tension underneath. The account was redirected. Redirected where? She asked quickly. I took a sip of coffee before answering. To educational scholarship programs. Silence. Complete silence. Then Vanessa spoke again. You gave it away? The words carried a mixture of disbelief and frustration. I donated it, I replied. Daniel exhaled sharply. Dad, we have already started planning for tuition expenses. I understand. Ethan is counting on that money. I looked down at my coffee cup. Interesting. Neither of them responded. For months, I continued, nobody seemed concerned about what I was counting on. Another silence followed. This one felt different. Heavier. Less comfortable. Vanessa finally spoke. This is because of the graduation, is it not? I did not answer immediately. The truth deserved more thought than a simple yes or no. The graduation helped me understand. Certain things, I said. What things? She asked. I leaned back in my chair. That my presence had become optional. That my involvement was welcome only when it required no effort. That decisions about family had been made without me for a very long time. Daniel interrupted. Dad, nobody wanted to hurt you. I almost smiled. Not because the statement was funny, because it sounded so familiar. Throughout life, some of the deepest hurts arrive without malicious intent. People become comfortable. They make assumptions. They stop noticing the impact of their choices. Then one day they discover consequences they never expected. Intentions do not change outcomes, I said quietly. Vanessa's voice sharpened slightly. You are punishing Ethan for something he did not do. That accusation hung in the air between us. I considered it carefully before responding. No, I spent over a decade helping Ethan. I do not regret a single dollar. But continuing that support was always a gift, not an entitlement. Neither of them replied. The silence stretched long enough for me to hear a clock ticking somewhere in their house. Eventually Daniel spoke again. This time his voice sounded smaller. Older somehow. Dad, why did you not talk to us first? I looked around my kitchen. The question settled over me like a familiar memory. I spent years trying to stay connected, I said. Years showing up whenever I was invited. Years accepting explanations. Years pretending not to notice when invitations stopped arriving. My voice remained calm. At some point, conversations stopped working when only one person is having them. Nobody interrupted. For the first time since the call began, they were simply listening. Do you know what hurt the most? I asked. It was not missing a ceremony. It was realizing nobody even noticed I was missing. The silence that followed felt different again. This time, there was nowhere left for anyone to hide behind logistics, schedules, or misunderstandings. The truth sat plainly between us. After a while, Daniel spoke softly. I did not realize things had gotten that bad. I believed him. That was the tragedy of it. Not cruelty. Not hatred. Indifference. People become accustomed to someone always being there. Then they stop seeing the person entirely. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes. Questions were asked. Explanations were offered. Apologies appeared cautiously, as if nobody quite knew where to begin. Yet underneath, everything remained one undeniable reality. The money was gone. The decision was final. By the time the call ended, nobody was shouting. Nobody was angry. They simply sounded stunned. After I hung up, I carried my empty coffee cup to the sink and stood quietly for a moment. Across town, I imagined difficult conversations unfolding. College budgets being reviewed. Expectations being recalculated. Assumptions being challenged. For the first time in years, the consequences of exclusion no longer belonged solely to me. 3 days after that phone call, there was a knock at my front door. I was in the garage organizing old tools when I heard it. The sound echoed through the house. Slow. Hesitant. Not the confident knock of someone expecting a warm welcome. I set down a wrench and walked toward the front entrance. When I opened the door, Ethan stood there alone. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically. Emotionally. As though the past few weeks had forced him to confront realities he had never considered before. Hi, Grandpa, he said quietly. Hello, Ethan. He shifted his weight awkwardly. Can I come in? I stepped aside. Of course. We sat at the kitchen table where so many family conversations had taken place over the years. The same table where Margaret used to serve Sunday dinners. The same table where Ethan once spread out science projects and homework assignments. For several moments, he simply stared at his hands. Then he finally looked up. I did not know. The words were simple, honest. I believed him immediately. Did not know what. I asked. About everything. His voice cracked slightly. The fund, the invitations, the school events, any of it. I remained silent and let him continue. Dad told me what happened. Then I started asking questions. He looked down again. I wish I had asked them sooner. Outside, sunlight filtered through the kitchen window. Dust particles drifted lazily through the air. Ordinary details. Yet the moment felt important. Not because of money. Because of truth. Why are you here, Ethan? I asked gently. He took a deep breath. To apologize. The word hung between us. Not for the fund, he added quickly. That was your money. You had every right to do whatever you wanted with it. He swallowed hard. I am here because I should have noticed. I should have realized you were disappearing from my life. I studied his face carefully. For the first time in years, I saw the little boy who used to follow me around the garage asking endless questions about how things worked. Not because he was still a child. Because he was finally willing to look honestly at something uncomfortable. You were young, I said. That is not an excuse. No, I agreed. But it is part of the explanation. Ethan nodded slowly. I kept assuming everyone else handled family stuff. I never stopped to think about who was missing. He looked toward the living room, where framed photographs lined the shelves. Then I started looking through old pictures. You were everywhere when I was growing up. His voice softened. Then suddenly you were not. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, Ethan reached into his backpack and pulled out a photograph. He slid it across the table toward me. It was from graduation day. The official portrait. Cap and gown. Bright smile. The future stretched out ahead of him. But something had changed. In the bottom corner, written in blue ink, was a message. Thank you for every fishing trip, every science project, every lesson, and every chance you gave me. I should have said it sooner. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. Not because of guilt. Not because of vindication. Because gratitude has a way of reaching places anger never can. I do not expect you to change anything, Ethan said quietly. I just wanted you to know that I finally understand. I looked at the photograph for several seconds before setting it carefully on the table. Then I smiled. A real smile. The first in quite a while. That understanding is worth more than you realize. Ethan stayed for nearly 3 hours. We talked about college, career goals, engineering programs, life. For the first time in years, the conversation felt natural. Unforced. Not arranged by someone else. Not filtered through family politics. Just a grandfather and grandson talking honestly. When he finally stood to leave, he hesitated near the front door. Can I come by again sometime? He asked. You never needed permission. He smiled at that. Then he left. I watched his car disappear down the street before returning inside. The house felt quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. Peaceful instead of lonely. Later that evening, I sat on the back porch as the sun disappeared behind the trees. Margaret's note rested beside me. So did Ethan's photograph. I thought about everything that had happened. The exclusions. The disappointment. The difficult decisions. The conversations that followed. If someone asked whether I regretted my choice, the answer would still be no. The money had gone where it could help young people build meaningful futures. That remained true. But something else had happened as well. By finally respecting my own worth, I had forced others to confront what they had taken for granted. Some relationships never recover from that kind of reckoning. Others emerge stronger because of it. Time would reveal which path my family ultimately chose. As darkness settled over the neighborhood, I looked once more at Ethan's photograph and smiled. The greatest lesson of my life had never been about money. It was about value. If people treat you like you do not matter, eventually you must decide whether you agree with them. I finally chose not to.